Hello and welcome to Times Like These, the online sessions made by Scripture Union NI. My name is Phil Howe and I am the Training and Resources Manager for SU here in Northern Ireland. In today's session, we're thinking about this cultural moment and specifically what are we learning in this cultural moment. We want to consider what God is teaching us in times like this. I know from my own learning that language is helpful and that instead of talking about a post-COVID world, it could be more helpful to talk about a plus-COVID world. And that might be helpful in terms of our mind shift and thinking about planning, posture, perspective. And I mentioned planning there. And in these times, it seems like plans are useless, but planning is indispensable as we have so many what-if conversations and some things that will never see the light of day because it seems that things are changing so fast and the future is so uncertain. You see, our immediate future has always been unknown, it's always been uncertain, but this pandemic seems to put that right in our face. All our life is unknown, and we think that the feeling of certainty and knowing is a good thing, but in reality, it's an illusion, and we're forced to see the real picture through this. But there is hope. Even as we think about other significant moments in history, whenever we think about 9/11, people still got on airplanes afterwards. And so maybe in the words of Bear Grylls, we need to adapt, improvise, and overcome. And so we need to be wise. James chapter 1 verse 5 says, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Coming back to language, 2020 seems to have taken a bit of a hit, and we can't seem to wait until 2020 is out of the road. But as we face this new reality, we need to understand that COVID's not lurking around, and then once midnight hits on December 31st, we'll hear, my time is up. We seem to be living in this limbo land. It's a bit like the time between Christmas and New Year, where we don't really know what day it is. We don't really know what we're supposed to be doing, but we do know that a time's coming whenever it'll work itself out. It actually turns out that the time between New Year's and Christmas has been the new limbo land. And there's a hunger to go back to the new normal, whatever normal is. We want to get on with things. We hope for better, which is a picture of the Christian life, isn't it? To steal biblical themes, it seems that we're living in this now, but not yet. And connecting with wisdom, Proverbs 16:9 says, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. How we get through this is by asking God for daily bread, but also realizing the big picture. We keep the big picture in mind, but realizing the Lord establishes our steps. Our steps can be small. They're not giant leaps. And it's one step at a time as we keep our course on mind. And there's a mixture of beauty and brokenness in how we operate. We see the gift of technology, and yet even the reality for young people that we serve, that we can't live on the internet all the time, that face-to-face connection and contact is so special and so significant. So those are some of my ramblings, but you may be pleased to hear that my learning is not the focus of this session. I'm delighted to welcome Mel Lacey. Mel has a unique contribution to make from a UK and Ireland perspective because of her background, experience, passion. And so it's so good to have you, Mel. Thanks so much for being with us. And I know for me personally, you've been such a big help and a great voice in this time. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, background, what you do, and how you ended up there?
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. Really great to be with you. I am working for an organisation called Growing Young Disciples, which is a pretty new organisation. But this is my 20th year in full-time ministry. You can tell from my accent that I don't come from England or Northern Ireland, although lots of people think I do come from Northern Ireland. I come from Dublin and was born and raised there. And when I was about 22, I moved to Bangor in Northern Ireland to serve in my first ministry role in a Church of Ireland church there. Then I served in a mission agency in Northern Ireland as well before moving to the UK, England, to do youth and kids work in the local church. And then from there I went to a Bible college where I was the director of youth and children's ministry training for 11 years before starting to work for Growing Young Disciples. So I've done lots of stuff in ministry, but particularly focused on youth and children's ministry in the last kind of 15 years. I've also overseen some of the kids and youth work at the big festivals here in England. So I'm pretty passionate about kids and youth ministry. I do youth and kids ministry in my local church as well. So my whole life is given over to helping the next generation to know Jesus.
And that's why it's so great to have you here. Can you just tell us a wee bit more about what is Growing Young Disciples? You said it's quite new, and just tell us a wee bit about your role within it.
Yeah, sure. Well, in England, there's been a conference that's happened for kind of 16 or 17 years that was run by, originally it came out of a publishing company, and then it moved into being run by a group of friends, and it was lastly known as Growing Young Disciples. And wonderfully, it grew so big that we eventually had to think about doing something slightly more significant with it, or finishing it, because we couldn't just run it as volunteers ourselves. And so we were at a crossroads where we thought, is it viable to make this into a more significant organization that doesn't just support youth and kids workers for those 4 days that we're together at the conference every year, but supports youth and kids workers and families workers and parents all year round. And so probably about 2.5 years ago now, we took the decision to launch Growing Young Disciples officially as a charity. And I was then invited to become the first director of Growing Young Disciples. And so I basically spend my life talking to youth, kids, families, workers, doing lots of training, supporting parents. In non-COVID times, I'm driving around and traveling lots to speak and to train, from local churches to Bible colleges. In COVID times, I'm spending most of my time on Zoom, but still doing the same, training, equipping, resourcing and advising anyone and everyone who's just passionate about helping children love and live for Jesus.
And if people want to know more about that, is there places where they can go?
Yes, growingyoungdisciples.org.uk. We also have a Growing Young Disciples discussion forum on Facebook. That's proving really valuable, I think. Lots of people are getting lots out of that, enjoying good conversations, building relationships, praying for one another and resourcing one another through that. So we've got a lovely community which comes together every year at the conference anyway, but we're now creating more of a year-round feel of loving and supporting each other together.
Yeah, and I've been to the conference and I'm on that group, and it is so helpful. So thank you for your work behind the scenes to make that happen. Mel, we're thinking about this cultural moment. Take us on a bit of a journey. Like I've been involved in some of your training where you kind of paint the landscape that young people are growing up in. What have you seen change kind of pre-lockdown, during lockdown, and kind of as we start to come out the other side possibly? For example, I know before you've mentioned about security seems like a big deal for the younger generation because they haven't known a time since before 9/11, and there's a sense of fear. And I know I've mentioned before at the start there about this idea of language is important whenever we talk about discipleship and following Jesus. And it seems that young people don't really like talking about risk, but it is costly to follow Jesus. So how do we wrestle with that type of language, or will it always be hard to break through, particularly because of what we're facing right now?
Yeah, there's a few things, Phil. I think this generation, which is known as Gen Z, so basically the 4 to 18-year-olds that we're caring for are Generation Z. And one of the character traits that's emerging about them is that they are risk adverse and they are concerned very much for personal safety and security, as you've mentioned. They are a generation that's lived, as you said, post 9/11, post 7/7, with the threat of terrorism and violence very much real in their lives. And also they're concerned about financial security as well. So essentially it's quite introspective worldly security that they're concerned about. That's been very clear in Gen Z anyway, up until COVID. And I think one of the things, it's still quite early in terms of research as we emerge from COVID, but one of the things that's undoubtedly going to be exacerbated by the pandemic is this need for safety and security. So we already see Gen Zers, the top level of Gen Z, being kind of not really up for going out. They're not kind of clubbing or partying in the way that previous generations may have done. And I think we'll see probably even more of that going forward. So Gen Zs being quite restricted to home, to comfortable and safe surroundings. But in a bigger way, just being really concerned to provide for themselves and in the future, any family that they may have in terms of safety and security. So that could be in jobs, in career aspirations, in qualifications, in money, whatever it might be. So I think one of the things we're going to see coming out of this is these young people who above all want to know what safety is. Now, I think wonderfully, as Christians, we obviously have the answer to that, because we know, and in fact, the pandemic is showing us that nothing earthly can provide us with that safety. So it's kind of ironic that that's what the pandemic is going to force our young people into, looking for more safety and security, whilst all the time it's illustrating that, as you said, we don't know what tomorrow will hold. Everything is being stripped away that we've put our trust in for security. And so I think one of the things we can do wonderfully is point to what it means to be safe and secure in Christ. My anxiety about saying that is that sometimes we're quite platitudinal in teaching those kind of doctrinal truths to our young people. We may say to them, oh, just be safe in Christ. You know that if you're in Christ, you've nothing to fear. But then they're looking around and they're seeing their families panicking, they're seeing the world panicking, they're not really seeing tangible examples of that doctrine lived out. And so I think for those of us who lead and who have young people in our homes, the challenge is actually going to be as much for us as for them in embodying some of these doctrines that we say we believe. So if we say we believe that ultimately security and safety is only found in Christ, when the rubber hits the road, what does that look like? So I think that's one big thing that we're going to be aware of. On the other hand, we're seeing that Gen Z, particularly some stratas of Gen Z, are concerned to be world changers and world shapers. And we've seen that clearly in Greta Thunberg, for example. And I'm sure that this experience, this lived experience of this year, is going to produce some pretty amazing young people who are driven by that passion to change the world. And so I think we need to watch out for that and nurture that. And I guess the challenge for us again is, how do we capture those young people's hearts for Christ? And then whatever profession they go into, however they flourish, their world changing would be focused on him. And so that if they go on to be professors of medicine, for example, because they've been struck by that need through the pandemic, that they do that in the way that's honoring to Christ. But also that they are motivated, again, I think, for sharing the hope of Jesus with others. So they've lived through this period where hope has become a bit of a catchphrase, hasn't it? We hope that we'll be out of lockdown in a few weeks' time. We hope that we'll be able to have Christmas. The vaccine is the new hope for the world. But actually, again, that's not our ultimate hope. And so I pray and hope that kids will be able to share that hope passionately, having experienced what it looks like to have earthly security removed.
And do you see, I mean, as I hear you talk, it seems like what young people were like, as you say, it's just been magnified a wee bit rather than lots and lots changing. It's just highlighting what the issues are.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's hard to see at the moment, I think, what if there will be any massive directional changes in how Generation Z were moving and maturing. I think what we're just going to see is actually some of the trends exasperated. On the other hand, they were longing for authentic life and relationships. And I think wonderfully, the pandemic has actually forced that longing, which is a good longing, because we're made in God's image to be relational. So we are made for friendship and intimacy. And I think what lots of us have found, those of us who work in kids and youth ministry, is that even when all the kind of surplus stuff, the games, the fun, the food has been removed from our youth and kids ministry, actually they still want to be there because they're concerned about their relationships. And so I wonder if that's really helpful, that we just focus in now on, let's nurture these relationships, let's allow them to relate to one another and to our church families well. So I think positively, some of the traits will be beautifully enhanced as we come out of this. And again, the call for authentic living, I think they're kind of sick of the fakeness of the cyber world, and they're, although caught up in much of it, also very aware of the fickle nature of it. And so what does it look like to be authentic, to share our hopes, our fears, our dreams, our anxieties, but always to point them to Jesus in terms of the answer to our hopes, our fears, our dreams, our anxieties. And so it's a challenge for us as leaders and parents and church family members to really step out and to share our faith, not just to assume that as they look at us, they're seeing it, but they need to hear it. And they need to hear us talking about Jesus. They need to see us living courageously for him. And I think that will be brilliant for the church going forward as well.
You've mentioned there about social media playing its part. Obviously, we want authenticity. And yet now for me at my age, I can separate out my kind of Facebook life and Insta life and my own life, whereas for the younger generation it's kind of just all encompassing. It's very hard for them to separate that out. So how do they, especially in these times when there's probably more time on social media, where are we seeing that kind of that wrestle for authenticity then? You know, you've got the likes of TikTok and Instagram and fake Instagram accounts and stuff. How do we encourage young Christians to still be authentic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like with the particularly TikTok, for example, we're seeing the trends are that it's much more younger tweens and teens who are engaged with that, and then the older ones are kind of not interested. Instagram, we're still seeing lots of general usage of that amongst young people. In one way, I think part of the challenge will be to help them to relate to each other well in that kind of relational way, and to be able to challenge, rebuke, encourage, so to call one another out, essentially. I think we often forget that aspect of Christian life, that we're to encourage, but we're also to rebuke and challenge, and that there is a place for brotherly and sisterly Christian love to say, hang on a second, I saw you post that picture, or I know that you have the Finsta and the Rinsta, like what's going on? How does that show Jesus? Is that consistent with who we are? And also then just challenging one another to be authentic themselves, so not to present that fake profile or the selfie kind of world. I think one of the things that's really interesting is actually we're seeing that young people are really reluctant to go on Zoom or any kind of video platform where they have to look at themselves, because they're so used to the selfie world where they can alter, they can filter, they can cause their appearance to look a certain way, and actually they're not loving looking at the stark reality of themselves. And that's pretty sad. And so we want to help them think about who they are, what they're like as those who are made in the image and likeness of God, and those who, if they're in Christ, are being remade into that image and likeness, and to see the inherent beauty and worth in all that. So I think there's loads of challenges for us to help them think through authenticity in a social media world, and just even challenges about how they're using their time, because young people are always being formed. They're either being formed by the world or the word. And so the more time they're spending on social media, they are being formed and informed by something. And so we then have to be able to step into that. I think we have to help them to understand those worlds, the Instagram world, the TikTok world, the Twitter world, if they're on that, the Snapchat world, help them to see the good and the beautiful and the true bits about it, what we might describe as the echoes of Eden, but also the bits that are harmful, that might skew their thinking, that might impact themselves and other people in the long run.
You've mentioned that we're on Zoom now, and it is slightly awkward because you naturally do start looking at your own screen. Maybe I'm just confessing too much, but it is weird that you do that. Because we do kind of have that weirdness about it. Also, you mentioned there just in passing about the Finsta and the Rinsta. Would you like to explain that for people here, maybe going, what on earth is that?
Yeah. So we know that lots of young people actually have two Instagram accounts. They're known as the Finsta and the Rinsta. So the Finsta is the fake Instagram account, and the Rinsta is the real Instagram account. So essentially a young person will set up the two accounts, and they're intended for two different audiences. So one is presenting kind of their everyday nitty-gritty lives, and that's to their friends, and kind of that's what they'll cultivate their online image. And then the other, the fake one, is essentially for parents, church family members, godparents, whatever, to show a kind of a much more controlled and sanitized perspective of their life, if you like. And I think our young people are schooled well in living duplicitously, so having two faces to present to the world, which is a real challenge again in the cry for authenticity. How do we help them not to do that, to present themselves in all of their fullness as they have been made by God to the world, and to not control and manipulate essentially how other people see them and interact with them online.
We're talking a lot about Gen Z, and probably whenever we talk about social media, it's more about teens. Is there anything specific to children at this time that you're kind of picking up on?
So certainly they're spending a lot more time online as well. We are seeing lots of kids kind of sadly on social media when they definitely shouldn't be in terms of age rating. So I think we shouldn't be naive and think, you know, kids aren't coming on to the different platforms until the age ratings allow them, even if they're on a parent or a sibling's kind of phone or whatever, they are looking at lots of stuff online. So we do need to be aware of that. Again, particularly TikTok, actually, lots of younger kids watching and engaging themselves in kind of the TikTok phenomenon. So just help them to understand that. And this whole quest for fame and notoriety and to go viral, I think lots of our younger children actually have that ambition to make something of themselves in the cyber world. I think we are still seeing anxiety and security issues in younger children. Lots of that is actually related to how parents are interacting with the pandemic. And so children are learning a lot from their parents' response to what's going on in the world, rather than necessarily cultivating their own feelings. But I think we will again see this younger generation grow up as ones who have been shaped by the pandemic. You know, our children have had a year where they haven't been able to hug anybody apart from their parents, essentially, where they've had to stand 2 meters away from anybody. And I think it actually will impact how they relate to people going forward. For lots of our children as well, this time is formative in terms of their worldview, how they look at the world. We know that a child's worldview is essentially formed by the age that they're 11. And so for all of our kids, there are specific aspects of learning that should be going on at this time. So for whatever developmental stage they're at, the COVID crisis will have impacted some of their learning and development. They haven't been at church for most of the year. They've just interacted on screen. That will have pretty significant ramifications for our ecclesiology, what we believe about church, what they believe about church, how they interact with the church family. It will impact our intergenerational nature of church, so how they relate to those older and younger to them at church. So I think we will see loads of things coming out of this. The good thing for our children and young people is that because school started again, they have a good degree of normality. So the regular pattern of life and the days have been slightly more restored. But that doesn't mean that they're fully back to kind of thinking about life in normal ways. And you said at the beginning, Phil, this is the new normal. And I actually think in God's kindness and great mercy, there's so much that we can learn through the pandemic, that as we emerge, it will actually impact us for the good in our lives, in our church family lives, and in the lives of our kids and young people.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Because we talk about wanting to go back to normal, but I remember seeing someone share, well, what is it from normal that you'd like to continue with, rather than just going back to what we think we would want. And so what are the positives that we can take from this? And I know this has been a real challenge as well for the church, because it's how do we infiltrate those spaces if young people are online more, but also has those challenges, doesn't it, of actually how are we communicating now with our young people, and that idea of should we be using Snapchat to tell them about, I mean, I don't see how you'd use TikTok other than you'll come along and I think that would work, but how do we infiltrate that world for the good? You're leaning towards this already, but there's two other groups impacted during this cultural moment: families and the local church. Is there anything that you want to speak into in relation to what you've seen? I know with your job, I mean, as you say, you usually travel, but you interact with so many different churches. I know that you invest in families, particularly whenever you're at Oak Hill. But what have you been learning are the biggest needs at this time as we think about families and the local church?
Yeah, well, I think what happened very quickly was that the discipleship of children was forced pretty dramatically back to be located in the context of the family. Before that, we probably thought, families will do a little bit, but the church is the main place where children are discipled. We have the paid professionals there, the youth worker, the kids worker, let them crack on with it. And obviously that was removed pretty quickly and dramatically. I do think undoubtedly that one of the benefits that we have to see of the pandemic is family time restored. One of the things about Gen Z that was, I think, obvious to certain aspects of that generation is that they were moving away from their families in certain ways. And now families are probably stronger than they've ever been for a long time. And that's not saying that family life has been smooth for everyone over the last 8 or 9 months. I know it has been fraught with many challenges from many families, but nevertheless, there has been a much greater concentration of family time than we've seen in decades. And I think that's a wonderful thing. We've got to encourage and nurture families together. So rather than thinking about going back to life before, where we kind of take the kids and we put them all in their programs and we separate the adults from the children, I think a challenge for us going forward will be, how do we think about church life intergenerationally? How do we resource parents to keep engaging with their children, so not to allow them, the day we switch back to normal, to go, okay, hand back over to the church, reins are handing back to you firmly. But I think one of the things that I'm very aware of is that we have very high expectations on parents, particularly in terms of how they engage with their children, but lots of parents just don't know how to do any kind of discipleship with their kids or young people at home. Probably slightly easier with younger children, and then it gets increasingly harder as kids grow into teenagers. So I'd love for youth, kids, families, workers, pastors, rectors, ministers to be thinking about how best to resource parents and to nurture family life in a way that allows them to thrive spiritually. So I think that
whenever we talk about family devotions, I mean, what I've probably seen is that there's loads of stuff for adults and children, like kind of, primary school age, but there's not a lot of resources out there whenever it comes to actually adults and teens. Yeah,
absolutely. Basically the teenage publishing market is a bit depleted anyway. In Christian terms, there's not loads out there. And I think we expect people to know what to do. It's very kind of repetitive, so we've no creativity. We need to help people to think through all of this. So what does it look like? I calculated last week, I think that, if parents are discipling children in their home for kind of 18, 20, 22 years, that's thousands of family devotions that they need to do. And if we're just pushing like one book at them or one style, that is going to get boring and tired. And so we need to up our game in thinking about this whole area, and also just what's expected of people. As much as that family worship or family devotional time is wonderful, everyday moments, Deuteronomy 6, talks about speaking of the things of God when we walk, when we talk, when we sit, when we stand. And actually, that's the key, I think, to the discipleship and worldview building of children, to help them see the world through the word, is just take every moment as teachable and be speaking about the things of God. But lots of our parents need help in doing that. And the expectation is high, and I think the resourcing is low. So that would be a great thing for us to focus on as we come out of the pandemic, to nurture families well together.
And whenever we say resourcing parents, it's not just resourcing them as in here's the resource here, but it's actually helping them think through, like you just said there, the opportunities where they're able to speak up. What are the questions that they can ask? how do you just open up a Bible and go through a book, and how do you get stuff out of that without needing someone to regurgitate something or have a plan to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as much as resourcing, we need to teach and train adults as well, and give them the skills, and relieve them of some of the pressure that they're feeling, that it has to be kind of picture perfect what they do, but just to crack on, and use the moments they can to teach about the Lord Jesus.
Sorry, I interrupted you there. Were you going to say something else?
I think I was going to say, about kind of just family life and church life then. One of the things that we probably do in church life is that we often compete. So we'll kind of run kids, youth, and then adult stuff at the same time. And so everyone's segregated. They're popped into their category, their silo, and we keep each category apart. I think we can begin to think more about what intergenerational church looks like. So rather than having heavily programmatic ministry methodologies, maybe to think about how do we do this in a way that nurtures the whole church family, so including the older people, the widowers, the single people, and what does it look like to have every generation represented in a much more significant way in our church family life. So not just in our kind of services on a Sunday, but when we have a mission supper, when we have a weekend away, when we have our prayer meetings. We often call our prayer meetings at church our church family prayer meetings, but actually we hold them at a time when probably 50% of the family is already in bed. So just to be challenged to think about supporting the families as we emerge from this. And I think lots of the patterns of life and ministry that have been established pre-COVID are up for grabs now, and we can do things differently. And I think it would be remiss of us to just transition back to the way we've always done things. I think in kids and youth ministry, and generally maybe in church ministry, we're often pragmatists. So we do things a certain way because we think they work. And what this pause is allowing us to do is to reflect biblically and think, well, actually, are our methods and our pragmatic ways glorifying to God? Are they consistent with his word? Are there things that we could change in a way that the pandemic is allowing us to do, which ordinarily could have been pretty tricky because we don't like change in church either? So, I think this is God's gift to us again. As I know in Northern Ireland, you've used the term kind of circuit breaker for the vaccine or for the pandemic. I think this is a circuit breaker for the church as well. To break down maybe things that we haven't done as consistently with scripture as we might have done, and to reflect on our ways that might have been more pragmatic than theological. So great opportunities for us, I think.
Yeah, and I know for me and my own church, it's been great that we're seeing more input from the whole church. It's the priesthood of all believers. And this idea there's no junior Holy Spirit, and where everyone has a chance to be able to speak in. So it's been lovely to see, and hopefully something that does continue. Yeah. Mel, I'm going to turn you into Mystic Mel for a second, okay? Help us see into the future. What do we need to learn and carry with us? Like, what do you see as the landscape for children's and youth ministry over, say, the next 5 years through the impact of this? I know some of this we're kind of speculating, but what do you see as you've been chatting, as you see kind of where we've come from, where we're heading? What do you think?
One of the things we know, particularly about youth ministry, is what we do in youth ministry often emerges in the adult church about 15 years later, as youth become adult members, vestry members, elders, leaders. So we must realize that what we do now is going to critically impact the church of the future. So the young people are the church of now, but they're the leaders of the church of the future. So I do think we need to think carefully and seriously about how we emerge from this. I think a number of things that I'm aware of that kind of we were struggling with anyway pre-pandemic, and maybe this is a great opportunity for us to address. So we basically have poor ecclesiology, so young people and children who don't understand church and don't know what church is, why they're part of church, and what it looks like to belong to church. So I think one of the great things we could focus on going forward is that category of ecclesiology, so helping young people to know and to love and to understand what it means to be part of God's church. I think discipleship is going to be massive, and I think certainly going forward that is going to be the focus of our youth ministry, because the pandemic is stopping us from doing other stuff, whether that's outreach or evangelism, or kind of social, just social stuff with our young people. That's all been kind of choked at the moment. So I think we need to think about what robust discipleship looks like. I'm pretty convinced that this is one of the hardest times for young people to be alive. It's very complex, very confusing. It's also a hard time for parents. And so I think to engage really well with the issues that are pressing in on our young people and children, and to help them understand them. So in some ways that's going to require us as the workers to skill ourselves up as well, to know what we're talking about, what we're dealing with, and how to help them. And I think with our young people, they're consistently saying they want more. So they are this generation who are quite serious. They're concerned about the world. They want to impact the world. And, in some recent Church of England surveys, young people said the reason why they wander away from the church is because they're not taken seriously enough. They want to know the answers to the big life questions, to the ethical debates and discussions, and they say we just want to entertain them. So I think in terms of our discipleship, let's think about that. What does it really look like to help them engage with a complex world as well, and to bring the issues that are out there to bear on their lives here and now. Essentially, we want to help them to prepare to leave well, so that when they become adult members of a local church, whether that's when they go to their first job or to uni or wherever it might be, that they're able to hit the ground running and stand for Jesus. So I think there are two things: ecclesiology, discipleship. I think evangelism is a real struggle at the moment for everybody, but particularly in kids and youth ministry, because what we've seen is our core kids have hung around, but those kids on the periphery that we had contact with have kind of disappeared. And again, I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about how we do evangelism amongst young people and kids. We've often done what's described as a funnel model, where we just get as many kids and young people in and hopefully filter them down into the church eventually. We just can't do that now. And I think we need to think about a reverse evangelistic strategy. So thinking about our own children and young people. So, my group of 10 to 13-year-olds, if there's 15 of them, they all have at least 5 significant contacts during the day in school and going forward in kind of clubs and stuff like that. I want to focus now on equipping my 15 young people to be evangelists to their friends. And instead of just training them to be inviters of others, so say, bring your friend to this event and I'll tell them about Jesus, I want to say to them, you need to tell them about Jesus. I'll help you, I'll equip you, I'll train you, but please, please tell your friends who are rushing to an eternity apart from him about Jesus.
Yeah, we need to move away from that idea of saying, where is everybody, which offends everybody in the room. And I say, you're here, and move away from this idea, to entertain might fill a building, but actually to disciple will change the world. So, how do we move to that mindset?
Yeah, and I think we have become pretty introspective and a bit self-concerned during the pandemic. So we'll be concerned about ourselves, our safety, our family, whatever we're missing. But actually, time is marching on, history is moving on. God is still delaying the return of Jesus because he longs to build his church and a people for himself for eternity. And in his kindness, he's including us in that. And so, the evangelistic task hasn't diminished, but it maybe is changing in terms of how we do it. And so I think that's one of the areas we're going to have to adapt to really quickly to help to skill up our kids and young people to be able to share the gospel effectively themselves and their lives in a way that shows the beauty of the gospel.
And so help us to pray at this time. What should we be praying? And even if you want to share, even how can we be praying for you and growing young disciples?
Thanks, Phil. This is a big one, isn't it? I could give you a list as long as my arm, probably. I think we need to pray very much for our young people that are feeling insecure, anxious, and that particularly will probably emerge in some ways in mental health issues. We haven't touched much on that, but certainly there's a prediction that the already kind of epidemic level of mental health issues amongst young people is only going to increase. So we want to pray into that very much. And we want to pray that our kids and young people know how and where to find safety and security, but also that we and others might model that to them well. And I think that's got to be an ongoing prayerful endeavor. I think we need to be praying very much for families, for the protection of families and the equipping of families as we go forward. And I think like a very legitimate prayer is for the rebuilding of our work amongst children and young people. I think lots of people are feeling so discouraged because it looks like it's been decimated, but that God would help the rebuilding, but would also encourage his people who are working in his harvest field, that actually our job is simply to be faithful and to discharge the duties that he has given us as best we can, because we know Jesus has said that he will build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail. And that's our hope, that's his promise. And that's what should motivate us day by day. A pandemic is not going to stop that. It hasn't in the past. It won't in 2020. And that is joyful. So to press on knowing that our confidence is in him, that God is calling men and women and boys and girls to faith. We've seen over the course of the pandemic, lots of people coming to faith. But in Iran, for example, just, reports of millions of Christians in a closed country. And so there's wonderful evidence of God at work across his world. And so let's go forward in that knowledge joyfully, that God's not stopped in his tracks. The mission of the church hasn't stopped. And numbers aren't everything, despite what your boss may say or the people putting pressure on you. But discipled hearts are. And so let's focus in well and prayerfully focused in well on the young people and kids that we have in our care. For growing young disciples,
yep.
We're new, we're young, we're developing our ministry. Just love you to pray that if it is of God, it would be encouraged and it would grow, and that we would be useful to the local church. We're all about supporting the local church, so that we would be able to do that well.
Well, you've definitely been an encouragement now, and you've definitely been helpful in the past, so hopefully that can continue. So just thank you, Mel, for your time. If you're watching or listening and you have some learning that you'd like to share, let us know in the comments section, or if there's something in particular that Mel's been talking about that stood out to you, feel free to comment then as well. So thank you so much, Mel. Thank you for you guys for watching and listening. Hopefully you have been blessed, encouraged, challenged as and where appropriate. And to catch up on all our other online sessions, feel free to check out our Facebook video playlist, our YouTube channel, or our podcast. God bless.